What if there are constraints on what we can buy with certain portions of our budget? How does this change our utility maximization strategy? Let's explore these questions using the example of the SNAP program, also known to some as food stamps. In the U.S., the government provides a debit card to low-income households that can only be used to purchase food. In this example, I'll ask the question, should the government just give people cash to be used as they wish instead of a debit card that can only be used for food? Suppose that a low-income individual has an income of only $5,000. Suppose further that this individual is so poor that he spends all his income on just two things, food and shelter. Finally, to make life easy, suppose the price of 1 unit of food is $1 and of 1 unit of shelter is $1. Note that this is a trick we'll often use to make examples easier. By setting prices to $1, total spending is the same as total units. And you can always just define units in a way that the price of a unit is $1. So we could say, for example, that we're comparing food in terms of bags of chips to housing in terms of rent per square inch of an apartment. The budget constraint in this case is a straight line that shows all the combinations of food and shelter spending that the individual can afford. In this graph, the x-axis shows the amount of housing purchased, and the y-axis shows the amount of food purchased. On the same graph, we can draw indifference curves, showing the utility trade-offs between food and housing for this person. Remember, higher indifference curves correspond to greater utility. The highest indifference curve that a person can afford is the one that just barely touches the budget constraint, here at 500 units of food and 4,500 units of housing. As we showed earlier, this is the indifference curve that's tangent to the budget constraint at point A. So this is the combination that gives him the highest utility at a budget of $5,000. It is at this point that the marginal cost of food, the slope of the budget constraint line, is exactly equal to the marginal benefit of food, the slope of the indifference curve. So utility is maximized at this point. Now suppose the government wants to transfer $1,000 more to this person, and it wants to figure out the best way to do so. If it gives him $1,000 in cash, his budget constraint shifts out by $1,000. Prices haven't changed, so all that's happening is the budget constraint is further out. Now our individual can afford to be on a higher indifference curve that's tangent to the new budget constraint at point B. Suppose he chooses to spend $800 on food and $5,200 on housing. Just like before, this is the point at which the marginal cost of food is equal to its marginal benefit. But what if instead the government gave this person a $1,000 debit card that can only be used for food? Now the budget constraint is kinked. All $6,000 can be spent on food, but only $5,000 can be spent on housing. This is shown as a budget constraint, which is a straight line at $5,000 for the first $1,000 of food. That's because the government gives you $1,000 to spend on food for free, but you can't spend it on anything else. No matter what you spend on food, up to $1,000, you can always get $5,000 of housing. But if you spend less than $1,000 on food, you still only have $5,000 of cash to spend on housing. So if you spend $500 on food, you can get $5,000 of housing. If you spend $750 of food, you still get $5,000 of housing, and so on, up to $1,000 of food. Therefore, you should always spend at least $1,000 on food. Otherwise, you'd be throwing money away. The government is giving you $1,000 of food for free, and since more is always better, you should spend it. Once you spend beyond $1,000, then it's coming out of your own money. So then you need to spend less on housing. Therefore, beyond $1,000, we return to the regular downward sloping budget constraint. But note that with this new budget constraint, the indifference curve that contained point B is no longer affordable. Instead, the food stamp recipient must settle for this lower indifference curve, which intersects the budget constraint at the kink at point C. He spends all $1,000 from the debit card on food, and the other $5,000 of income he spends on housing. But he's worse off with this debit card compared to cash. When we just give him cash, he chooses to spend only $800 more on food and to spend $5,200 on housing. But when we restrict him, he has to spend $1,000 more on food, so he can only spend $5,000 on housing. That is, if the government gave him cash, he'd like to use some of the cash to buy a better place to live. But by giving him this debit card, the government is restricting him from spending more on housing. Why would a government do this? One reason is that the government may have an interest in ensuring these resources go towards food rather than towards other purchases. Suppose that the government thinks that the person won't be spending his non-food budget on housing, but rather on cigarettes or alcohol. In such a case, the government may have an incentive to constrain the choice of the food stamp recipient. That's exactly what food stamps do. They limit your choices. Typically in economics, we don't like to do this. Indeed, there's evidence that shows that people are worse off when the government gives them food stamps rather than the same amount of cash. So the government is penalizing people by giving them food stamps instead of cash. On the other hand, the government is preventing people from using the money on cigarettes and alcohol. Is this trade-off worth it? Recent evidence suggests not. There have been a series of evaluations conducted in the past few years that examine the effect of giving unrestricted cash to the poor. Most of these evaluations have taken place in developing countries, but a few have been conducted in the United States and other higher-income countries. Overall, these evaluations find that very little of the cash is spent on cigarettes and alcohol. It's mostly spent on food. In developing countries, it often provides valuable resources for individuals to start or grow businesses. So perhaps government should stop being paternalistic and just give them cash.